Welcome to Crimes and Minds, the podcast where two therapists diagnose potential criminals. This episode of Crimes and Minds will contain discussion about violent crimes, including sexual assault, rape, murder, bullying, and crimes against children. If these topics are a trigger for you, please consider skipping this episode.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, I know we wanted to start today by introducing ourselves a little more and giving a little more background about who we are. Do you want to start, Rachel?
So I am a licensed clinical social worker based out of New York City, and I'm interested in true crime and interested in criminals and their diagnoses. So I partnered up with Joni, who's also a therapist.
Awesome. Like Rachel mentioned, I'm a therapist. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in New York City as well. We both own our own private practices and work with a myriad of clientele. I typically work with those who've experienced some sort of trauma. But like Rachel mentioned, I am also very interested in true crime and especially the mental health and psychological perspective of it. And so when we realized we shared this common interest, we would just start talking like between the two of us about true crime cases and recommending different documentaries and articles. And then after one time we talked about it, Rachel was like, we should do a podcast. So that's sort of how Crimes and Minds was born. We're very excited to bring you our third episode today. We're tackling a massive case. I think we're both feeling a little nervous, not to put words in your mouth, Rachel, but I know we both just are aware of how massive this case is, and we want to do it justice.
Definitely. And it's being talked about now. We're discussing Rex Heuermann today, also known as the Gilgo Beach Killer. And he has a court date coming up April 17th. So we're recording April 13th. This will be quite a timely case. So we do want to do it justice, like you said, Joni.
Absolutely. Before we get into some of the nitty-gritty details of the case, you heard Rachel's content warning at the beginning. So just a reminder about that. Also, just a reminder that neither of us have ever treated Rex or anyone involved in this case in any matter. Although we're two mental health professionals, we are not officially giving diagnoses, and we just want to put it out there. This case is still in process. And so Rex right now is known as the alleged Gilgo Beach murder, but that has not been proven. And because in America, we're innocent until proven guilty, we just wanted to throw that out there. So there's lots of details that point towards him. But again, this is an alleged case at this point.
Right.
Well, I'm just going to try to give some sort of overview of this case. It is complex. There's a lot of details. So Rachel, jump in when I miss something, but we're going to go all the way back to 2010 to start talking about this case. So almost 15 years ago at this point. And I remember when this first happened. I remember reading the articles on, waiting in line at the grocery store. I remember hearing it on the radio. And so I have truly been following this case for almost 15 years. But it started when Shannon Gilbert went missing. Shannon Gilbert was last seen in May of 2010. Shannon was a sex worker. She was listing her services on Craigslist, and she lived in the greater New York City area, and she got a call for Long Island. And so she went out to Long Island, and at some point during that night, the details are a bit hazy, but essentially she called 911 saying that people were coming after her. They were following her. She even had a security driver person waiting for her in the driveway. And he's in the background of the 911 call trying to calm her down. The person who hired her was trying to calm her down. And then she just took off running. And it's a very long 911 call that has since been released. She went and knocked on someone's door. It was an elderly gentleman who spoke to her but wasn't comfortable bringing her in. Completely understandable. I would also be skeptical to let someone in my house. It's kind of middle of the night. There's a lot going on there. After that, she is never seen again. And so while they started searching for her, they really didn't, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, but my understanding is they didn't give it a lot of weight. And probably now we know in 2024, it's because she was a sex worker. And unfortunately, there was even more of a big bias against sex workers in 2010 than there is today. And so they kind of just chalked it up to she was having a mental health episode and she never returned. We don't know what happened. Her family did not believe that. They fought tooth and nail for her. And so in December of 2010, so a little over 6 months later, randomly there was an officer and his canine searching a part of Long Island known as Gilgo Beach, and the canine unit found remains. They assumed it was Shannon. They did testing. It was not Shannon. They, over several days, found 4 human remains of 4 different people. Those people now we know are Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. And I wanted to mention their names specifically because I think it's important that we remember them. They were all sex workers. They all were murdered between 2007, 2010, and they all seem to have the same killer, just based off of how they were buried and such. Over the next few years, they would go on to find, Rachel, was it 10 or 11 in total?
11.
11 remains of different people. One of those eventually was Shannon Gilbert, who started this whole case. However, her death is still ruled as an accidental death. So that is giving you like a very little drop in the bucket of this story.
Yes. And it took them 13 years of investigations before they found a suspect. There's a lot to go through here, so it's a little overwhelming, but we have been following the case as New York therapists. It's pretty local to us. And so here we are in 2024 while he is going to trial to discuss this case a little bit further and what was going on mental health wise.
Yes, absolutely. One very jarring piece of this case for me, other than the horrible acts of crime, obviously, but it's just how the system failed us as society in this case. I mean, this took nearly 15 years to find the suspect, the main suspect in the case. They had a couple leads in that time, but nothing panned out, and that would happen very quickly. It wouldn't be a major suspect because the person would have an alibi or whatever it was.
But also there was major corruption in the Suffolk County Police Department. Yes. So there was not major progress made in this case until they established a task force in 2022 involving many different government agencies, including the FBI. And when they came in, a lot of progress started being made.
Yes. And I want to shout out Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison for that. The 2 previous police commissioners since this case began, since 2010, have both been suspected and or indicted on criminal charges while they held their office. And so it is clear they were trying to keep the FBI out of this case because they allegedly didn't want the FBI to kind of dig into them as people and their crimes and the corruption. And so in 2022, Police Commissioner Rodney Harrison took over, immediately established a task force. Within a few months of the task force inception, we now know they had Rex as the main suspect. And then a little over a year later, they made the arrest. I mean, a year is a long time, but compared to a decade and a half that this went on, I mean, Commissioner Harrison really, he got the job done. And so I just wanted to shout that out and note, wow, there's a lot going on. I mean, there's a lot going on here.
Yes, apparently police were sitting on about 3,000 tips, and they just didn't act on really any of them in any kind of substantial way.
Wow. That is incredible in the worst way possible. That is just mind-blowing. You know, there was a lot going on. There were definitely tips that they weren't taken seriously. There's also been new technology with DNA sampling that I think really also aided this case quite a bit. But to go back a little bit, so like we mentioned, there were 11 bodies found or parts of bodies found. Rex has been indicted for the alleged murder of 4 of the 11. So he has been indicted for Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber. And I believe it was Maureen was not initially a part of that group, but it was not until a couple months ago they also
Yes.
got him on that. The other 7 of them, Shannon has been assumed to be an accidental death. So then the remaining 6 of them, we don't have answers to still. Maybe he was involved, maybe not. Those were a bit different. One of them was a toddler, which is heartbreaking and disgusting. One of them was the toddler's mother, who was a sex worker. So all of them were sex workers. There was one biologically male, assigned male at birth person, and they were dressed in women's clothing. So we're unsure what they identified as or what their gender was, but we know that they're a part of the group. That person has not been identified, unfortunately. And also, they're a part of the group that they have not, at least, told the public of any suspects for those remaining 6 people.
Right. Should we dig into the background a little bit?
Yeah, go for it, Rachel.
Okay. So, Rex, just to dig into his background growing up, he grew up with 3 older sisters and a younger brother. He grew up on Long Island, and his dad was an aerospace engineer. And apparently, Rex and his father had a very challenging relationship.
Yeah.
His father was known to be very tough on him for not being a go-getter, so he acted out. He was caught after a shoplifting spree, and there was a really good New York Times article about Rex as like a teenager from his classmates.
Mhm.
And one of them said, "Why is he getting in trouble? He's fighting with his dad. It was common knowledge." And then, unfortunately, his father died when he was 12 years old. And after that, he and his siblings were raised by their mother, but maybe in part due to grief, who knows, PTSD, Rex was teased mercilessly as a child. So he opted out of social life. But one thing he did enjoy was architectural drawing class, which is appropriate because he later established his own architecture firm. But classmates said when they tried to talk to him, he didn't have the social skills to hold a simple conversation. And also they said he was known for fighting back after he was pushed past his limit, and he had a mean streak. Also, after graduating from high school, he spent several years doing part-time cleaning and maintenance at Jones Beach, which is ironic because it's very close to where the bodies were found years later that he is allegedly accused of killing.
Yes.
So he went on to college at the New York Institute of Technology on Long Island, where he studied architectural technology. And he eventually, like I said, started his own business as an architectural consultant. And he became proficient at making sure renovations followed intricate building codes, but was known to torment many of the contractors and homeowners he dealt with.
Yeah.
So yeah, despite him being a loner and being called like strange, weird, awkward, he did end up marrying twice. His first marriage lasted 3 years, no kids. Second marriage, he became a father to 2 kids. One is 26 years old now, his daughter, and the other is 33 years old, his son, who has special needs. And I found it very interesting that he had a daughter, and alarming that she's around the same age as the women that he was targeting to allegedly kill.
I know, that is so jarring for sure. Also, his daughter works at his architecture firm. And so there was some sort of relationship there if she was working for him.
Yes, I read that both children or kids were living at home when Rex was arrested.
Yeah. Speaking of his home, I found it very interesting. I mean, he lived in a pretty affluent area, is my understanding of Long Island. The aerial shots I saw on, the various clips we watched looked like beautiful homes. His home, I mean, one news clip I watched just straight out said, like, this home does not fit in this neighborhood.
Yeah, it was so dilapidated. It was actually his childhood home that he bought in the 90s, and he let it fall into disrepair.
I did not know that it was his childhood home. Okay, wow, that's fascinating.
He bought it from his mom.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting because I assume he was a successful architect. I mean, he had contracts, his business had contracts with companies like Target and Nike. And so he clearly had some level of success in his line of work, but did not really keep up on the home. It seemed like actually it was falling apart in some places. And so when police arrested him, they also had a search warrant for his home. And they went in, and Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong, was the official number 278
79
weapons. 279 weapons. Guns specifically were found in his home. There was some sort of vault type room found in the basement that he had built. He had spent a lot of money and time on that specifically, not necessarily the rest of the house. So they are unsure if any of the murders took place in his home. That is not a part of the alleged killings.
Also, his wife and his family are not appeared to be involved in this at all. So his wife did file for divorce just a few days after he was arrested.
Yeah. So
but she continues to visit him in jail weekly.
Yes. And has stated through her representation that she does not believe he's guilty, that she finds it really difficult to believe, but she also just cannot remain with someone who obviously has held some sort of double life because of everything we now know about him. Also, one of the reasons why they were able to track his DNA is actually some of the hair, like follicles on the victims, were matched to her hair, the wife's hair. Now that police have been very open about that, they do not believe she was involved in any way. It is likely that the victims were in his home and that his wife's hair somehow fell on them. Maybe it was on him and fell on him. Maybe it was just, they were just in the home on the furniture. We don't know. But that is one of the ways that they actually arrested him, and he's been indicted, is for that DNA.
And they followed his daughter actually on Long Island Railroad, and she was drinking a Monster energy drink, and she tossed it when she got off the train, and police retrieved it and got some DNA evidence off of that, which went to show that there was a 4,000,000% match to a relative of the DNA found on one of the victims.
Yeah. And how they really got Rex himself, my understanding is he had thrown away a pizza box and it had crusts in it. And they had a private investigator following him. And the investigator grabbed the box out of the trash in Manhattan, like I think his office is on Fifth Ave, like very busy part of Manhattan. The private investigator grabbed the pizza box, which honestly, living in New York City, that wouldn't even faze me, seeing someone grabbing a pizza box out of the trash. Like, I'm sure no one even noticed. Yeah. And that is how they got a sample of his DNA himself. And then he was later arrested right outside of his Manhattan office.
And we actually watched a brief interview with his former executive assistant. Yeah. And she said that she was surprised when she found out that she had a bad gut feeling about him, but needed the money when he offered her a high salary.
Yeah.
And then she said that she would be the one to buy him the pizza. And she said, it always bothered me that he never ate the crust.
And then that's how he was found. So ironic. Many people, as this often happens in true crime stories, is that when someone is indicted, when someone's arrested, many people kind of come out of the woodworks and are like, oh, I had this interaction with him, or I knew him. The general themes of people who came out of the woodworks were a lot of former sex workers, a lot of women in general. And there were some high school friends or I don't know if they were friends, acquaintances, I guess, as well. But the general themes were he had a temper, he had a dark side, he was creepy. He had an obsession with the Gilgo Beach murder, which is a huge way police connected him. He had multiple burner phones. His searches, he would obsessively and compulsively search. Those were words the police task force used. Would search for the victims' family members. After one of the murders, he had been using a burner phone to call one of the victims' 15-year-old sisters at the time.
Yes.
Which is horrific. I cannot imagine being 15 years old and getting that type of phone call. And they weren't at the time able to pin it because they could tell the location was somewhere in Manhattan, But because of the millions of people in Manhattan on any given day, there was really no way to trace a specific number or a specific cell phone. However, they have since figured out, okay, he had an office in Manhattan, he was there, and he lived on Long Island.
I just want to say one
Yeah.
thing that when he called the 15-year-old who was the younger sister of one of his victims, he confessed. He said, I killed your sister, and he taunted her and he threatened her. And I cannot imagine how traumatizing that must have been, especially after losing your sister, and
Yeah.
how just terrifying it would have been.
Heartbreaking. Oh my. Wow. It's interesting. That also happened with Shannon Gilbert, who he has not been indicted for her murder. She was the original person who kind of started this case. Why, police eventually found all of these bodies. And her family, days after, got phone calls from a local doctor. He identified himself on the phone, a local doctor who said that he saw her or that he had her. She was in some sort of home and that he knew where she was and that he was taking care of her. It was very bizarre. She ended up being found right by his property. Like you could see where she was found from his back deck. Now, police thoroughly investigated him. This is not Rex we're talking about. This is a local doctor. And he had an alibi. He denies it was him. Maybe it was someone pretending to be him. Maybe he was somehow set up for that. We are not totally sure, but it is a common thread with Shannon that the others had as well, which is someone was calling the families and taunting them and really, really making it known, hey, I'm out here, I'm watching you, type of thing.
Yeah, so terrifying.
So terrifying.
And
Yet,
whether or not like the doctor was a different person or whether it was Rex, we honestly don't know, but police have made it clear that they think there might be more than one serial killer
yeah,
just because the methods of the killing was
yeah,
so different
yeah.
for all 11.
Yeah, one theory I read like last summer when Rex was first arrested, in the summer of 2023, was that maybe it was a group working together, but it was multiple killers. And now I haven't really heard much about that theory since then, and I think rightfully so, the police are tight-lipped about it, right? But I do wonder, like, was there a connection overall, maybe, even though there were multiple killers? We don't know. I don't know if we'll ever know that, unfortunately.
He's pleading not guilty now
He is, which,
to all of the alleged killings.
yes, yeah, which is why we're being, just super cautious using the word alleged, because he has not been proven guilty yet. As of now, there will be a trial. There
And the
will,
next trial date is April 17th.
yeah. So we'll find out more then. Lots of mental health themes in this case, Rachel. I mean, we have the obvious Rex, right? And we'll get to him. I did want to point out there was a lot, though, even in 2010, we knew about some of the mental health struggles that the victims had, that maybe their family members had. It's believed Shannon suffered from some sort of mental illness and had what they called an episode, which is why it was a natural cause of death. Maybe she had an episode. I'm putting that in quotes because that's what was used. And I don't know her official diagnosis, so I don't want to use terminology that isn't appropriate. But she, maybe had a manic episode or something like that and ran into the woods and drowned, is what they believe may have happened. So there was that. Also, her mother was a very active part of that case. In fact, the mothers of all of the victims really came together back in between like 2010 and 2014. They were like very involved in each other's lives. They were advocating. They were really trying to get news and media to stay on the case. And her mother was tragically murdered herself by another daughter who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia and who had a schizophrenic episode. And so I just like there are layers of generational trauma and of mental health themes in this case. And I think it's important we take a nuanced perspective on that and just know that it's not just the victims, it's not just allegedly the murderer, Rex. It's also the families, who I imagine have trauma associated with this.
Yeah.
It's also everyone reporting on it. It's also the police. Like there are so many people involved in this case who have seen it up close and personal, whose lives have been affected, allegedly by Rex and his horrific acts.
Yes.
We know, Rachel, that they got him on the DNA. We talked about the pizza crust. We talked about the hair follicles found on the victims. We also know they tracked the burner phones, right? Another thing they found was really horrible searches, Google searches related to pornography.
Yes.
Some of those included children. The New York Times published the list, and Rachel was sharing some of the things
Yeah,
with.
a couple of them that really stood out and just
Mhm.
disgusted me were slave porn and medieval torture of women. And there's just quite a long list. If you
Yeah,
want, you can,
yeah,
research it yourself on the New York
yeah.
Times.
Yeah. The level of misogyny in this case is just really is hitting me hard. Like there is a deep, deep hatred for women.
And that's so wild that he had three sisters
Yeah, and he
and
was
then
really
was
raised by
raised
his mom
totally.
and married to two women throughout his life, has a daughter, and it's scary, honestly. Now, Rex himself, Rachel gave a lot of great info on his childhood. Rachel, what are your thoughts about his mental health?
Well, I think clearly he was a depraved individual.
Yeah.
So maybe he had a bit of post-traumatic stress disorder from whatever type of negative relationship he had with his father, in addition to all of the abuse that he suffered at the hands of his classmates in
Mhm.
school
Yeah.
from like a very early age through high school.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say maybe a bit of post-traumatic stress disorder, possibly, and then narcissistic personality disorder.
Yes. I think that's a good
Yeah,
possibility.
but definitely antisocial personality disorder,
Yeah.
which is the diagnosis of psychopath.
Yeah. I mean, if he did commit these crimes, if he's proven guilty, you would have to be a psychopath. You would have to have antisocial personality disorder in order to be able, honestly, to commit these crimes. The reason we also wonder about narcissistic personality disorder is he would often like want to know if the police were getting closer to finding him, not out of self-preservation, but out of like pride. Like he kind of wanted to be known for this, right?
Mhm.
He also just like different things people have said about him throughout his life is also why we wonder about that in his not being able to be wrong ever and how he treated other people around him. And so that's why we're wondering about the narcissism as well. Rachel, you also mentioned some social issues in school. Now, maybe that was because of the bullying. So maybe he just honestly wasn't comfortable. Maybe there's something more like a neurodivergence there, ADHD or autism, that would impair some social skills if he wasn't, being taught coping mechanisms. And given he grew up in the 1970s, 80s, I can just imagine that none of that was known. None of that,
Yeah.
he did not get the help he needed or deserved as a kid.
Right. And just to go back, the New York Times article about him and it touched on his mental health based on interviews with his classmates from high school. It was so interesting. One of his classmates said he was a loner and a target, and he was everybody's punching bag,
Oh,
which is very sad.
it is. It's so sad. I'm having a hard time grappling with this. I feel bad for him as a kid. There are all these different pieces of his story that aren't fair, right? The strained relationship with his dad's death, the bullying. There was a lot going on there. He obviously needed help as a kid, and he obviously did not get the help he needed. I obviously mostly empathize with the victims in this case. And I think this is where we can really talk about how mental health is nuanced. Like, there's so many different mental health themes in this case. And I, as a human, as someone in the helping profession, as a professional, I can hold nuanced opinions at the same time. So while I feel bad for him, I also think what he did is unjustifiable and horrendous. And I feel horrible for the victims' families who now have had to live with this. I'm hoping that the establishment of the police task force his arrest have brought them some comfort and validation. And just knowing that their work got them somewhere, that they put in all of this effort, and that hopefully it can bring them a very small level of comfort in what they deserve.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And this case has been followed by so many. It was such a long case. And so there are a lot of podcasts out about it, documentaries.
Yeah.
And I recently read that his wife and kids are going to receive at least $1 million for the NBC Peacock documentary, which will
Yeah.
follow the family throughout his trial. A
Wow.
lot of money.
Yes, it is. Yeah. I can't blame them, right? I'm sure they're in shock. I'm sure they feel like they need financial stability. I am very curious to watch that
We'll
documentary. I'm sure
definitely
you
be
and I will
following.
be watching it. And I maybe we'll do a part two of this episode. Who knows? But it's definitely an ongoing case. Rachel, what have we not talked about? What have we missed?
I think we've covered most everything. Like,
Yeah.
if we were to treat Rex, I would say there are a lot of possibilities for his diagnosis, but
Mhm.
definitely would be antisocial personality disorder,
Yeah.
among other potential diagnoses, which we discussed.
Yeah, I agree. And personally, I would not treat someone with this diagnosis. I am not qualified to do so. I would definitely refer out to an inpatient program. I think someone with an antisocial personality disorder diagnosis needs the highest level of care possible.
And we're mandated reporters as therapists.
Yes.
So if we even suspected anything, we would be, like, by law required to report to authorities
Yeah.
what our suspicions are.
Yeah. Something I find myself discussing often in our podcasts and just in our discussions about true crime is vulnerable populations, because those are often the populations we're talking about. They're often the populations who are the victims of murder and various true crime things. And I fully believe his victims were a vulnerable population because they were sex workers and they're just not protected. They don't have the same privilege. And another aspect of this case is the child pornography. And also, he has not been indicted for the murder of the toddler. That's still unknown. If he's involved in that case or whoever is, that would also be another massive vulnerable population to just consider in all of this. If, of course, if I have any inkling that someone I'm treating is involved in any sort of crime against children or other vulnerable populations, I am mandated to report that. And so I have to believe that he did a really good job living a double life. I mean, he had to go to the doctors throughout the years. He was married with kids. I have to believe that he, unfortunately, if he is found guilty, he did an incredible job living this double life. Many of the people who, sort of reflected on him after they found out he was arrested for this have said that he would talk to people about this case all the time. He had an obsession with it. I don't know. Now it's one of those things where now that we know we have the puzzle pieces and can put it together, I'm wondering if anyone else suspected him. Was he any of the leads that the police were sitting on? I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever know. But it's hard to believe that no one suspected him.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. Some people said they were not surprised at all. It makes sense. And other people said they were shocked.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, such a heavy case. Like we've mentioned, there's another court date. Probably by the time this episode comes out, it will have already happened. So I'm very curious about that. We are going to be continuing following this case. I'm open to doing a part two to this.
Yes.
Rachel, any closing thoughts?
This was a very heavy case. I would just say, if you or anyone you know are struggling with any type of mental health issues, there are resources for you. We'll link them in the description box. And do you have anything else you'd like to add?
If you or someone you know is in need of help, please call 988 to access the National Suicide and Crisis Line. For additional resources, please visit NAMI, NAMI.org. We will put all of this in the show notes as well. We want to make sure we're providing appropriate resources should this bring anything up for anyone, because I can't imagine it not, honestly.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you for getting those resources.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for listening. We will be updating you on this case, and we're excited to continue bringing you more content in the future.
Yeah, thanks for watching.